Hi, my name's Liam, and I'm working on my dream game. Well, first, I'm learning how to make games. See, 2 years ago, I purchased a humble bundle by Game Dev TV for Unreal Engine, and I gave up after the first hour. But now, I'm on a journey to explore everything that the learning material has to offer. So join me as I dive headfirst into game development and craft the beginnings of a dream game. This is the Dev Log Prologue. I really wanted to take these lessons seriously, so I created a code template document filled with notes, code, bugs, and their associated fixes. This reference guide should set me up well enough for when it's time to tackle the dream game. For the time being, this will be our toolbox. Toon Tanks was the next big project on my course list. This demo package came with the basic arena, some meshes, particle effects, sounds, and existing input maps for Unreal Engine 5.0, which had since depreciated. So, starting out, I had to convert to Unreal Engine 5.4's enhanced input system, which at this point I'm pretty familiar with. From there, I whizzed through the first 2 hours of lecture content and found myself feeling a bit frustrated with my lack of progress. But when I actually looked at what I had learned, I realized that I was making some serious headway. My code template document had grown by over 4 pages, and I had a much better understanding of base classes, uProperty specifiers, forward declarations, and linking actor components in C++. Despite feeling slow, I managed to create a C++ base for my tank and turrets, complete with collision and a projectile spawn point. But then, I ran into the first issue of the project. Every time I hit compile, my turret and tank meshes would reset back to default, and I would lose my meshes. After turning off live coding, the issue was fixed, so lesson learned, we won't be using live coding for the rest of this section. From there, I experimented with debug spheres as part of a fire function, added in tower rotation and tank rotation so that the tank turret follows the mouse. Eventually, I paired our newly formed fire function with a projectile spawn. A day or so later, and halfway through the lectures, I was definitely feeling it. Every other lecture added a couple more pages to my coding notes, and I started getting tons of ideas on how to expand on this game. Flash games like Tanks, Pocket Tanks came to mind, and I even considered adding pitch to the tank, gravity on the projectiles, and even destructible terrain. Then, it hit me. I just thought up Worms 3D on the PS2, which is a little too ambitious for me right now. With that in mind, I shifted my focus back into the project to stop myself from getting too carried away. After all, my priority with this prologue is to learn how to make games, then make the dream ones. With that, we hit another snag. The code seemed to be right, same with the blueprint, but the projectile just hovered in place and didn't seem to want to move. After about an hour of troubleshooting, it turns out the issue wasn't my code, but with the projectile spawn location being too close to the collision capsule. A quick adjustment, and our tank was firing and the projectiles were moving. Shout out to the Reddit comment section for helping me out with this one. After some more learning, I dove into mapping hit events, adding a health component, damage types, and a bunch of functions important for our dream game toolbox. Finally, after some more complex code, our projectile was moving and disappearing as it should. 6 hours into the lecture content, it was time for a break. I didn't want to slow my progress, but at this point, a 7-minute lecture on game mode classes just wasn't in the cards. But after a quick breather, it was back to work with 2 hours and 45 minutes left of lecture content to go. This next section had us programming upon death and setting up some game mode classes. The previous lectures all touched on game mode classes quite a bit, so I wasn't too worried about this section. Game modes will allow us to set rules for our games, like win conditions and loss conditions. Programming upon death, on the other hand, for this section, turned out to be far more involved than I expected for C++, but eventually we made it through. Things were feeling pretty awkward without a visible cursor, but when you know it, the next section had us adding one. A small detail, but overall a considerable improvement to the feel of our tank controls. After some more Apex, I made a game start widget. This was one of the first times I found myself working ahead of the lecture content and correctly predicting the next lines of code and the next steps. The extra time I put into polishing Cryptrator had me feeling pretty proud of myself here. Zooming through another 2 hours of content, we had a fully operational countdown timer, win and loss screens, and programmed conditions. Safe to say, we learned a lot. This altogether brings me to something outside of the Toon Tanks content. I've really got the idea ball rolling on a larger game project. I hate to call it a dream game, but I've been thinking about it more and more lately, and I've already started working on a written devlog. The content here is just the prologue, but I'm happy to share that our game development toolbox is slowly and surely becoming more of a workshop. But more about the dream game in a later video. Adding hit particles and smoke trails to our projectile took a whopping 16 minutes of lecture content. It was surprisingly straightforward, and it made our game feel like an actual game. But of course, not everything can run smoothly. Our next real bug came with the death particles. A 6-minute lecture turned into 2.5 hours of troubleshooting. For some reason, every time the death particles were set to spawn, Unreal Engine would crash. My kiddo was very supportive through the process, but the problem wasn't the temperature, it was the code. I noticed that when comparing this line of code to my original reference, I had included the destroy function in the particle effects. As we've learned, referencing nothing breaks things. So after removing our null pointer, things were exploding the right way. From there, I added some sound effects, which again dramatically improved the feel of our game. I wasn't a big fan of the punch, kick sound effects that were included in the Toon Tanks project package, so I went ahead and made some of my own. I love the arcade feel of my projectile and death effects. It was kind of reminiscent of Kid Chameleon, and I loved the feel of it, and it really added some much needed character to our game. At about 7.5 hours of lecture content and a dozen or so more in troubleshooting, we're in the final stretch. The last 2 tasks of the lecture content were camera shake and polish. The goal was to shake the camera when our projectile either hit something or when the pawn died, but we hit another slightly smaller snag. The content wanted us to use matinee camera shake as our blueprint base, but according to Unreal Engine and Reddit, this depreciated back in Unreal Engine 5.1, so we had to make do with camera shake base and figure it out from there.
A few moments later.
Turns out, camera shake base wasn't the way to go. Legacy camera shake was the better option since it actually included oscillation and blend time options. Reddit comments, even the score, 1 for 1. I'm sure as we get more familiar with camera shake, we'll actually be able to figure out what to do with camera shake base. Got everything coded up and compiled. Time to see how it feels. The camera shake adds a lot to making our game feel more complete. Now to do the same for the death camera shake, add it to basepawn.cpp, compile, add our death camera shake class to each of our pawns, and there we have it. Way more intense than the original hit projectile shake. First, our movement was kind of blocky, so we smoothed it out by enabling camera lag and camera rotation lag in our BP pawn tank blueprint. After adding those, the tank movement looks and feels a lot better. Last thing to polish was the towers. After the tank dies, they kept firing, which was kind of annoying with the added audio and camera shake. To fix this, we created a bool indicating that the tank starts out in an alive state, and programmed the alive state to false in the handle destruction function. From there, we just added the alive condition to the check fire conditions for the towers. Easy peasy and pretty straightforward. Also did some code cleanup. We had a couple of return functions set to auto, so what we did is we went back and changed them to their respective pointers. Our final task was to make the game our own. I'd already added some sounds that I had developed, and I think it could use some more polish, but I didn't want to get too carried away this time. After all, the point of the prologue is to go through the game dev content and learn the skills we need to make our own games. Now, it wouldn't be much of a prologue without a couple of hiccups. I'll spoil something. I spent a good 2 hours trying to figure out how to make a visible health bar for our tank to no avail. There were lots of YouTube tutorials that were available specifically for this purpose, but none of them were compatible with our health component. I did take a peek at the next chapter, and near the end of the Simple Shooter course that's coming up, they did walk through just that, so I decided to leave the health bar where it was, and I'll explore health bars more after the next lecture series. And that just about wraps up Toon Tanks. I love the arcade game feel, and it's certainly a project that I'd like to return to. I created a bit of an ambition log for this project for once I become more proficient with C++ and Unreal Engine. Maybe then I'll return to the game and make it a bit more of my own. But for now, we're looking forward to our next project and the next video, which is Simple Shooter. It looks fun and has a lot more of what we're looking for in our dream project, with a total lecture time of about 8 hours, so stay tuned. If you made it this far, thanks for watching the video, and consider leaving a like or subscribing to stay tuned for future updates. I'm getting a little bit better at editing videos and a little bit better at finishing up these lectures, so videos should come out a little bit more frequently than they have been. But anyway, thank you very much for watching, and have a great day.